In the unforgiving heat of the Texas summer, where the sun bakes the earth until it cracks like old leather, a mother's desperate journey would change an entire community. Clutching her fever-stricken twin babies, she stumbles across miles of dusty plains toward the only hope left, a lonely ranch owned by a man known for his cold shoulder to strangers. The locals whisper that his heart is as dry as the drought-stricken land he tends, but sometimes the harshest terrain can yield the most unexpected mercy. As she collapses at his gate, this moment will test not just one man's compassion, but the very fabric that holds a community together. Could this hardened cowboy's response to a mother's plea become the miracle that transforms not just two fragile lives, but an entire town's soul? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn crept across Thornfield Ranch like a hesitant visitor, casting long shadows over a land parched by 3 years of merciless drought. James Thornfield had already been awake for an hour, his weathered hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, as black as the night he'd left behind. From his porch, he watched the sun paint the horizon in shades of amber and rust, colors that seemed to mock the barren earth below. The ranch's weather-beaten sign creaked in the morning breeze, its hand-carved letters, Thornfield, barely visible beneath decades of sun and storm. James had never bothered to repaint it. Like everything else on his 1,000 acres, it told its own story of endurance. Inside his ranch house, a collection of silver-framed photographs gathered dust on the mantel. He hadn't touched them in years, but their presence lingered like gentle ghosts in his peripheral vision. One showed a younger man in an army medic's uniform, standing proud beside a field hospital in some forgotten war zone. Another captured a smiling woman with eyes that seemed to follow you across the room. Sarah, his late wife, forever 32. The morning ritual began as it always did. James pulled on his boots, each worn groove a reminder of countless dawn patrols around his property. The leather creaked as he stepped onto the porch, adjusting his hat against the already fierce sun. His German shepherd, Doc, fell into step. Beside him, their shadows stretching across the cracked earth like ancient hieroglyphs, they checked the well first. A daily measurement of hope. The water level had dropped another inch overnight. James marked it in a ledger he'd kept for 30 years, his neat handwriting a stark contrast to the chaos of the drought. The numbers told a story more eloquent than words. They were running out of time. The cattle gathered at the far pasture, their ribs showing through dusty hides. James counted them by habit, 37 head, down from 60 last spring. Each loss felt like a personal failure, though he knew every rancher for 50 miles faced the same struggle. He'd sold what he could, kept the strongest, and prayed for rain that refused to come. In town, they called him the Hermit of Thornfield Ridge. Some said he was bitter, others claimed he was just plain mean. The truth, like most things in life, lay somewhere in the middle. James preferred solitude because it asked nothing of him. Silence didn't expect him to explain why he chose to live alone, why he turned away the church ladies with their casseroles and sympathy, or why he still set 2 places at his table every Sunday dinner. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew his attention. Riders meant trouble these days, usually neighbors looking to buy water rights or sell land at desperate prices. James straightened his back, feeling every one of his 62 years. Doc's ears perked up, but the dog remained silent, reading his master's mood. Through his binoculars, James spotted Tom Wesley's boy on his paint horse, kicking up dust along the fence line. The youth worked part-time, helping neighbors with odd jobs, and his presence usually meant someone needed something. James sighed, already forming the word no in his mind. But today would be different. Today, fate had other plans for the man who'd spent 15 years building walls around his heart. He just didn't know it yet. As the morning heat built toward another merciless afternoon, James Thornfield continued his rounds, unaware that before the sun set, his carefully ordered world would be turned upside down by a desperate mother and 2 tiny lives hanging by a thread. Sometimes, he would later reflect, the good Lord had a way of forcing a man's hand, of bringing light into the darkest corners of a wounded soul. Sarah Miller shook the last drops from the medicine bottle, watching them fall onto her daughter Emma's cracked lips. The empty bottle joined 5 others on the bedside table, each one representing another failed attempt to break the twins' fever. Through the window of her small farmhouse, the morning sun cast long shadows across Emma and Ethan's faces, their cheeks flushed with a heat that had nothing to do with the Texas summer. Her husband's pocket watch, the only thing he'd left behind when the drought drove him east in search of work, ticked away precious seconds on her chest. 4 days since the twins had taken sick. 2 days since the town doctor had shaken his head and said he'd done all he could. 1 day since she'd heard whispers about the man at Thornfield Ranch, the one they said had been an army medic, who might have medicines others didn't. The twins' breathing came in shallow gasps, their tiny chests rising and falling like wounded birds. Emma's dark curls stuck to her forehead. Ethan's usually active hands lay still at his sides. At 6 months old, they seemed impossibly small, against the adult-sized pillows. Mrs. Henderson from the next farm over had warned her not to try it. "That Thornfield fellow," she'd said, clucking her tongue. "He turned away the Carson family last month when their well ran dry. Man's got a heart like desert hardpan." But Sarah had run out of options as surely as she'd run out of medicine. The nearest town with a proper hospital was 30 miles away. Might as well have been 300 in her condition, with no horse and 2 sick babies. She'd traded her wedding ring for the medicine that now sat empty on the table. And still, it hadn't been enough. Dawn had barely broken when she made her decision. She wrapped the twins in their grandfather's soft flannel shirts, tucked a water canteen into her apron pocket, and started walking. The old shawl her mother had made, now torn and faded, offered little protection from the sun, but she draped it over the twins anyway. Every mother's instinct screamed at her to keep them in bed, but staying meant watching them slip away, and Sarah Miller hadn't survived 3 years of drought by accepting defeat. The first mile wasn't so bad. The second brought blisters. By the third, each step felt like walking on broken glass, but she kept moving. She sang to the twins, lullabies, hymns, anything to keep her mind off the pain and fear. When Emma stirred and whimpered, Sarah touched her daughter's forehead and felt her heart skip at the burning heat there. "Just a little further, my loves," she whispered, though she had no idea if that was true. The landscape played tricks in the heat, making distances stretch like pulled taffy. What looked like a mile could be 3, and 3 could be 10. The sun climbed higher, turning the world into a furnace. Sarah's throat burned with each breath, but she had rationed the water carefully, using most of it to wet the twins' lips. Her own thirst could wait. A mother's body, she'd learned, could endure almost anything when her children's lives hung in the balance. Through the heat haze, she spotted a fence line in the distance. The post had a familiar weather-beaten sign, its letters unclear but promising. Her pace quickened despite her exhaustion. The twins had grown so still in her arms that only their shallow breathing assured her they still lived. Behind her stretched a trail of footprints in the dust, marking her desperate journey like the stations of the cross. Ahead lay either salvation or rejection, and Sarah wasn't sure which would be harder to bear, but she had come too far to turn back now. Her children's lives were worth any risk, any humiliation. As she approached the gate, her legs finally began to buckle. The world swam before her eyes, but she forced herself to stay upright. Just a few more steps, just a little longer. The twins needed her to be strong for just a little longer. The last thing Sarah saw before her knees gave way was a tall figure emerging from the ranch house, a German shepherd at his heels. Then the ground rose up to meet her, and the world went dark. The bulletin board outside Miller's General Store told the story of Promise, Texas, in fragments of paper and desperation. Notices fluttered in the hot wind. Well digging services, farm equipment for sale, prayer, meeting for rain. Mayor, Thompson's latest drought declaration was centered prominently, its official seal doing little to soften the harsh reality of its numbers. 3 years of rainfall at 20% of normal, water table down 40 feet, 12 farms foreclosed since spring. Inside the store, Ellen Miller, no relation to Sarah, watched old Judge Harrison argue with young Pastor Roberts about cloud seeding. The judge wielded his cane like a gavel, punctuating each point about wasting money on newfangled nonsense, while the pastor's gentle voice carried the weight of his congregation's hopes. The Methodists over in Copper Creek had success with it last month, Pastor Roberts insisted, smoothing his collar in the heat. The judge snorted. Success? A quarter-inch of rain that evaporated before it hit the ground? That's not success. Son, that's desperation wearing a scientific mask. Ellen wiped down the counter for the 3rd time that hour, listening as she always did. 38 years behind this same counter had made her promises unofficial historian. She saw how the drought had changed them all, turning neighbors who'd once shared Sunday dinners into strangers arguing over water rights. The store's bell chimed as Doc Matthews shuffled in, his black bag looking emptier than usual. The town's only physician dropped heavily onto a stool, his face grave. Ellen, coffee if you've got it. The strong stuff. Sarah's twins, Ellen asked, already reaching for the pot. The doctor nodded, accepting the steaming cup with hands that trembled slightly. Used everything I had. Those babies need a proper hospital, but he trailed off, leaving unspoken what everyone knew. The nearest hospital might as well have been on the moon for most folks' means. Heard tell, she was heading to Thornfield's place. Judge Harrison interjected, turning from his argument. Fool's errand, if you ask me. That man's turned harder than last year's cornbread. Pastor Roberts shook his head. James Thornfield wasn't always that way. Before his wife passed, before is before, the judge cut in. Now is now. Man's got the deepest well in the county and won't share a drop, sitting up there on his ridge like some dragon guarding his gold. Ellen had heard enough. That dragon saved my Tommy's leg in '62 when the combine caught him. Didn't ask for a penny neither. She set down her cleaning rag with unusual force. Maybe if we'd all done a better job looking after him when Martha died. The store fell silent. Even the judge found something interesting to study in the floorboards. They all remembered Martha Thornfield's funeral 15 years ago, how James had stood like a statue, refusing every casserole and comforting hand. Within a month, he'd withdrawn to his ranch, speaking only when business demanded it. The silence broke as Tom Wesley's boy burst through the door, his young face flushed with excitement or fear. No one could quite tell which. Sarah Miller's up at Thornfield's place, he gasped. Saw her collapse right at his gate. Baby's looking real bad. Pastor Roberts was on his feet instantly. Doc? The physician was already gathering his bag. Not much left to work with, but I've got some medicines in the back, Ellen interrupted. Been saving them for an emergency. She caught the doctor's questioning look. Don't give me that face. Woman my age is entitled to keep a few things by. The judge cleared his throat. My Buick's out front, faster than your truck, Doc. Just like that, the arguments of moments ago evaporated like morning dew. Ellen watched them go, the bell chiming their exit. She turned to the bulletin board, its notices trembling in the wake of the closing door. Perhaps, she thought, it took a crisis to remind people who they really were or who they could be, given the chance. Through the window, she watched the judge's Buick kick up dust on the road to Thornfield Ranch. Behind her, the clock ticked away summer seconds, each one carrying the weight of 2 tiny lives in the balance. James Thornfield saw them coming from a quarter-mile out, a lone figure stumbling through the heat waves, rising off the dusty road, clutching something to her chest. He'd been fixing a section of fence, measuring the distance by the sun's climb toward noon. Doc's low growl alerted him first, then the shadow appeared, wavering like a mirage. He straightened slowly, years of solitude having taught him patience. Through his binoculars, the figure resolved into a woman, her dress caked with dust, a torn shawl draped over what he now recognized as bundles in her arms. Babies. His throat tightened at the sight. "Stay," he commanded Doc, though the dog had already settled, watching with ears pricked forward. The woman's approach seemed to take hours, though it couldn't have been more than minutes. Each step she took was smaller than the last, her determination visible in the set of her shoulders, even as her strength clearly failed. 20 yards from his gate, she stumbled, caught herself. 15 yards, and he could hear her labored breathing. 10 yards, and he saw the babies' faces, twins, flushed with fever, their small features drawn with a sickness he recognized all too well from his medic days. 5 yards from his gate, she looked up. Their eyes met across the distance, and James saw something that sent him back 15 years, the same desperate hope he'd seen in his own eyes as he'd watched Martha slip away, praying for a miracle that never came. The woman's knees buckled. James was moving before he consciously made the decision, muscle memory from years of triage taking over. He reached the gate as she collapsed, catching her and the infants before they hit the ground. Her skin burned with the heat of sun exposure. But the babies, they burned with something far worse. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracked and dry as the earth beneath them. "They're all I have." One small hand had left a perfect print in the dust on his gate latch. A mother's last grasp at hope. James felt the weight of it. Heavier than all his years of carefully constructed solitude, the babies stirred weakly in their mother's failing grip, their breathing shallow and quick. He knew he should turn them away. He'd done it before, had to preserve his own resources, his own sanity. The drought had taught them all hard lessons about survival and choosing your battles. But something about that handprint on his gate, about the quiet desperation in the woman's eyes. "Doc," he called, and the dog was there instantly. "Get the house ready." The German shepherd bounded ahead as James gathered up mother and children, in arms that remembered their strength. Behind him the gate swung closed on rusty hinges, its creak like the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. As he carried them toward the house, he caught sight of dust on the horizon. More visitors coming. The world he'd built so carefully, the solitude he'd maintained like armor, was about to change. Looking down at the 2 tiny lives burning with fever against his chest, he realized he'd made his choice the moment he saw that handprint in the dust. Some battles choose you. James laid Sarah and the twins on his bed, muscle memory from decades past guiding his movements. He reached under the bed, pulling out a battered medical kit. Standard Army issue, circa 1962, maintained with military precision despite 15 years of disuse. The familiar weight of it in his hands brought back a flood of memories, helicopter evacuations, field hospitals, the constant race against time. "Ma'am," he said, touching Sarah's shoulder, "I need their names and ages." "Emma and Ethan," she whispered, fighting to stay conscious. 6 months. Emma's older by 12 minutes, her eyes fixed on the medical kit. "You really were a medic?" 3rd Infantry Division. James was already moving, his hands checking the twins' vital signs with practiced efficiency. Their pulses fluttered like trapped birds, skin hot and dry to the touch, classic signs of severe dehydration complicated by infection. In the field, he'd seen men twice his size felled by the same combination. He pulled a thermometer from the kit, mercury, old style but reliable. Emma registered 104.2, Ethan 104.1. Dangerous but not yet critical. The window for action was narrow, but it existed. "Doc," he called, and the shepherd appeared in the doorway. "Water basin, clean towels, you know where." The dog disappeared, returning moments later dragging a basin by its rope handle, then departing again for towels. James uncapped a bottle of aspirin, crushing 2 tablets into a fine powder. "Been saving these for emergencies," he explained, mixing the powder with a few drops of water. "Military grade. Better than what you'll find in town." Sarah watched him work, her own exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "Everyone said you turned people away." "I did." He didn't look up from his task. "Still might, but these little ones..." He trailed off, focusing on getting the medicine into Emma's mouth first, then Ethan's. His hands never shook, though something inside him trembled at their small size, their vulnerability. Doc returned with the towels, and James began the careful process of cooling the twins down. Each compress was placed with precision born of experience: neck, armpits, behind the knees, places where blood ran close to the surface, where cooling would be most effective. "They'll need more than this," he said finally, checking their temperatures again. "Proper antibiotics, equipment I don't have. Then they'll die." Sarah's voice cracked on the question. James stood, walking to his window. In the distance, the dust cloud he'd spotted earlier had resolved into vehicles, at least 3 moving fast. "No," he said, surprising himself with the firmness of his conviction. "No, they won't." He turned back to Sarah, seeing her clearly for the first time. Young, probably mid-20s, with a strength in her face that reminded him of Martha. The kind of strength that moved mountains, or in this case, crossed 3 miles of desert with sick babies in arms. "Rest," he told her, gentler than he'd spoken to anyone in years. "You got them this far. Let me take the next watch," as if permission was all she'd been waiting for. Sarah's eyes closed. James checked the compresses one last time, then stepped onto his porch. The approaching vehicles were close enough now to identify Judge Harrison's Buick in the lead, followed by Doc Matthews' truck and what looked like Pastor Roberts's station wagon. James felt the weight of his medical kit in his hands. 15 years of isolation pressing against his chest. But when he looked back at the twins on his bed, at their mother's exhausted face, he knew his decision was already made. Some battles choose you, and some wars can't be won alone. The sun hung low on the horizon by the time the immediate crisis had stabilized. Doc Matthews had confirmed James's initial assessment. The twins needed more than what they had on hand. The closest hospital was in Sterling City, too far for the baby's condition. Their only hope lay in gathering enough medical supplies and expertise from the surrounding farms and ranches to create a makeshift intensive care unit. James stood in his tack room, the silver spurs in his hands catching the last light of day. He hadn't worn them since Martha's funeral, hadn't needed to. His stallion, Thunder, was trained to respond to the subtlest pressure of heel and voice. But tonight was different. Tonight, every second would count. "You sure about this?" Doc Matthews asked from the doorway. "I could make the ride instead." James slipped the spurs onto his boots, their familiar weight settling something inside him. "You're needed here. Besides," he managed a grim smile, "folks might be more inclined to help if they see me doing the asking. Novelty value." The old doctor nodded, understanding the unspoken truth. James Thornfield asking for help would. It would carry more weight than any other messenger. His very appearance in town would signal the gravity of the situation. The judge had already left to alert the outer farms, and Pastor Roberts was organizing a prayer vigil, though James suspected it would turn into more of a supply-gathering mission once word spread. Sarah slept fitfully beside her babies, while Ellen Miller from the general store managed cold compresses with grandmother's efficiency. Thunder sensed his master's urgency, dancing slightly as James mounted. The horse's coat gleamed in the twilight, his muscles tensed for speed. Doc, the shepherd, sat alertly by the gate, understanding without command that his duty lay with watching over the sick children. 2 hours, James told the doctor. "If the fever spikes again—" "I remember my training," Matthews interrupted. "Gently. Go." James touched the brim of his hat, then leaned forward slightly. Thunder needed no other signal, launching into a ground-eating gallop that sent dust swirling in their wake. The spurs caught the last rays of sunset, flashing like signals in the gathering dark. The familiar landscape flew past, transformed by dusk and urgency into something almost mythical. Each hoofbeat seemed to echo the twins' racing pulses. Each breath of wind carried the weight of their labored breathing. James found himself remembering other rides, medical evacuations in Korea, supply runs through hostile territory. But this was different. This was home, Lights appeared ahead, promised Texas, population 847 souls, who'd spent the last 15 years watching him retreat from life. Now he was riding toward them, pride set aside, because 2 tiny lives hung in the balance. He pulled up at Miller's general store first, where a small crowd had already gathered. Word traveled fast in promise, faster than any horse. They turned, to stare as he dismounted, spurs ringing against the wooden sidewalk. Some faces showed surprise, others suspicion, but all held questions. "Most of you know why I'm here," he began, his voice rough from disuse but carrying clearly in the evening air. "Those babies up at my place, they need more than what we've got, more than what any one of us has got." He paused, scanning the faces before him, faces he'd avoided for 15 years, belonging to people who'd tried to help him once, when grief had torn his world apart. People he'd turned away, one by one until they'd stopped trying. "I know I haven't been—" He stopped, started again. "I know what you all think of me, you're not wrong. But this isn't about me. This is about 2 children who deserve a chance, and a mother who walked through hell to give them that chance. I'm asking," his voice caught, and he forced himself to continue, "I'm asking for your help." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. Then Ellen Miller stepped forward, keys jingling in her hand. "Well," she said, "let's see what's in the back room." She looked at the gathered crowd. "All of you, start thinking about what you've got stored away. Medicine, clean linens, anything that might help. Just because we're a small town doesn't mean we can't save 2 of our own." Our own. The words hit James like a physical force. Somewhere in the last few hours, Sarah and her twins had stopped being strangers and become part of something larger, something he'd forgotten existed. The church bell rang out across promise, its bronze voice cutting through the evening air with unusual urgency. Pastor Roberts stood in the bell tower, pulling the rope with deliberate precision. 3 short rings, 3 long, 3 short again. The old signal for emergency assembly, not used since the grass fires of '59. Inside the church, the pews filled quickly. Work-worn hands clutched hastily gathered supplies, medicine bottles, clean linens, canned goods. The last rays of sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting kaleidoscope shadows across faces both familiar and forgotten, to James as he stood at the front, thunder's dust still on his clothes. Ellen Miller had organized the medical supplies on the altar, transforming the sacred space into a makeshift dispensary. She worked with quiet efficiency, sorting through donations and consulting a list from Doc Matthews. Antibiotics here, fever, reducers there, each categorized with shopkeeper's precision. "The church bell," Judge Harrison remarked, settling into the front pew with a grunt. "Haven't heard that signal since—" "The fires, yes," James interrupted, surprising himself by continuing the conversation. "I remember. Lost my south pasture that year. And I lost my barn." The judge nodded. "But we rebuilt. Community came. Together then. Just like—" He stopped, watching James's face carefully. Just like they should have after Martha died. The unspoken words hung between them. James turned away, focusing on Ellen's inventory, to hide the sudden tightness in his throat. The church door opened again, admitting a blast of hot air and Mrs. Henderson from the dairy farm. She carried a large metal container, making straight for Ellen. "Fresh milk," she announced. "Still warm, and I've got more coming tomorrow if needed." "Bess Henderson," Ellen smiled. "You're a blessing. Those babies will need proper feeding once they're stronger." The pastor's footsteps echoed. Down the stairs, from the bell tower. He paused at the sight of the transformed sanctuary, then smiled. "Reminds me of the story of the loaves and fishes," he said softly. "Sometimes abundance comes from unexpected places." James watched as more people arrived, each bringing what they could. Old Mr. Chen from the pharmacy, closed at this hour but opened specially with a box of medical supplies. The Rodriguez family carrying stacks of clean blankets still warm from the line. Even Tom Wesley's boy ran in, clutching his mother's secret recipe for fever tea. The church filled with quiet. Conversation, with purpose, with hope. The bell's echo had barely faded when Pastor Roberts called for attention. "Friends," he began, "we all know why we're here. Two of God's smallest children are fighting for their lives up at Thornfield Ranch." He paused, his eyes meeting James's. "And one of our own has asked for our help. One of our own." There it was again, that phrase that scraped against 15 years of carefully constructed walls. James felt the weight of every eye in the church, but for once he didn't retreat from the attention. "What we need now," Ellen took over, practical, and always, is organization. These babies need round-the-clock care. That means shifts of volunteers, supply runners, and people coordinating it all. She unrolled a large sheet of paper across the altar rail. "I've drawn up a schedule. 3-hour shifts, working in pairs. One person with medical knowledge paired with one helper. We'll need drivers for supply runs to Sterling City, cooks to keep the volunteers fed, and people managing inventory." The Sadduce pastor stepped forward. "Now, before anyone signs up, understand what you're committing to. This isn't a one-day crisis. These babies might need weeks of care. We're not just volunteering time, we're making a promise. A promise." James looked down at his dust-covered boots, remembering other promises. The ones he'd made to Martha. The ones he'd broken to himself. The ones the town had made to him that he'd been too blind to see. "I'll take first shift," Mrs. Henderson said, breaking the silence. "My Paula can handle the evening milking." "Put me down for driving," the judge added. "Buick's got a full tank." One by one, they stepped forward. The schedule filled with names, with offers, with commitments. James watched as the simple sheet of paper transformed into something more, a testament to what his neighbors had always been capable of, what they'd always been willing to do, if only he'd let them. The church bell still hung silent in its tower, but something else rang through promise that evening. The sound of a community remembering who they were, who they could be, when life demanded more than any one person could give. The wagon that had once carried hay now bore a different kind of precious cargo. James watched as Ellen and Mrs. Henderson carefully arranged medical supplies, milk containers and fresh linens, securing everything against the bumpy ride ahead. The judges. Buick would lead the way, followed by the wagon and 3 other vehicles carrying the first shift of volunteers. Thunder stood patiently in the traces, his coat catching the last light of day. The horse seemed to understand the gravity of their mission, his usual restlessness replaced by steady purpose. James checked the harness one final time, his hands moving with mechanical precision, while his mind raced ahead to the ranch, to the twins fighting for their lives. "Everything's secured," Ellen announced, climbing up beside him on the wagon seat. She held a kerosene lamp that would light their way once darkness fell. "Mrs. Henderson's in the back with the milk and medicines. Says she won't risk them spoiling in this heat." James nodded, gathering the reins. The leather felt different, somehow, less like the isolation he'd wrapped around himself for 15 years, and more like a lifeline, connecting him to the people behind him, to the small lives waiting ahead. The judge's car engine turned over, headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. Pastor Roberts offered a quick prayer from the church steps, his words nearly lost in the evening wind, but their meaning clear in the determined faces of the volunteers. "Ready?" James asked, though it came out more like a statement than a question. Ellen adjusted her grip on the lamp. "Born ready, James Thornfield. Some of us have been waiting 15 years to help you, whether you wanted it or not." The wagon lurched forward, wheels creaking a familiar song against the packed earth. Behind them, car engines hummed to life. The small convoy moved through promise like a hope-bearing processional, past darkened storefronts and curious faces in lamplit windows. Mrs. Henderson's voice rose from the wagon bed, singing an old hymn that caught and spread until it seemed to fill the dusty air. James didn't join in, but he felt the melody settle into his bones, replacing the silence he'd carried for so long. The town fell away behind them, and the desert night began to unfold, its star-scattered canvas overhead. Ellen's lamp swayed, casting shifting shadows that danced alongside them like spirits. Every so often, James caught glimpses of the precious cargo in his side mirror, boxes and bundles that represented his community's response to a stranger's desperate need. "You know," Ellen said after a while, her voice pitched to carry over, the wagons creaking, but not much further, "Martha would be proud of you today." James's hands tightened on the reins, but he didn't retreat into silence as he once would have. "She always said I was too stubborn for my own good. Smart woman. You're Martha." Ellen adjusted the lamp's wick. "She also used to say you had the biggest heart of any man she'd ever known. Said sometimes it was so big you had to hide it away, just to keep it safe." The wagon wheels found a familiar rut in the road, one James could have navigated blindfolded. How many times had he traveled this path alone, choosing solitude over the comfort of community? Now the night was filled with the sounds of others following him home, engine noise, hymn singing, the quiet murmur of people united in purpose. As they crested the last rise before the ranch, James saw lights burning in his windows. More lights than he'd lit in years. Doc Matthews must have found the old oil lamps in the storeroom. The house looked almost alive again, awakened from a long slumber. Thunder quickened his pace slightly, sensing home. Behind them, headlights swayed as the cars navigated the uneven ground. The wagon's contents shifted and clinked, a reminder of all they carried: medicine and hope, skill and determination, the strength of a community too stubborn to let two tiny lives slip away. "Welcome home," Ellen said softly as they approached. The gate. Not just to James, he realized, but to all of them. Something that had been locked away for 15 years was opening again, like a door long rusted shut, finally turning on its hinges. The gate stood open, waiting. Doc, the shepherd, bounded out to meet them, his bark carrying news of their arrival to those waiting inside. As James guided the wagon through, he understood that he wasn't just bringing supplies and volunteers. To his ranch, he was bringing life itself back to Thornfield. The old rocking chair creaked a steady rhythm in the corner of James's bedroom, now transformed into a makeshift hospital ward. Sarah sat watch over her twins, her exhausted frame supported by the chair Martha had once used to rock their own dreams and sorrows. The precious piece of furniture had gathered dust in the attic for 15 years, until Mrs. Henderson insisted on bringing it down, saying every mother needed a proper place to hold vigil. Doc Matthews worked with quiet efficiency, showing volunteers how to measure medications and check vital signs. The twins lay in James's bed, their tiny forms almost lost among the fresh linens Ellen had arranged. Emma's fever had dropped 1/2 a degree. Ethan's remained stubborn, but his breathing had eased slightly. "Time for their medicine," Ellen announced, consulting the schedule she'd pinned to the wall. She moved with the precision of someone who'd raised 4 children through every illness imaginable. "Mrs. Henderson, let's try some of that milk now, just a few drops at a time." James stood in the doorway, watching the coordinated effort with a mixture of awe and something else he couldn't quite name. His house, so long a fortress of solitude, hummed with purposeful activity. The kitchen had become a command center, the living room a rest area for off-duty volunteers, the porch a lookout post for the next supply run. "James," Pastor Roberts called softly from behind him. "Judge Harrison's back with more ice from town. Where should we—" "Root cellar," James answered, turning away from the bedroom scene. "It'll keep longest there." "I'll show you." They carried the precious blocks down the cellar steps, their boots leaving dusty prints on stairs that hadn't seen such traffic in years. The cellar air hung cool and damp, a blessed relief from the summer heat above. "Reminds me of that winter storm in '59, the pastor said, arranging ice blocks on the shelf. "Remember? Half the town sheltered in your barn when the roads froze over." James paused, a memory surfacing like a long-buried treasure. "Martha made soup," he said slowly. "Kept it going for 3 days straight. And coffee. Lord, I never tasted coffee so good as Martha's." The pastor straightened, studying James in the lantern light. She always said this place was meant for more than just ranching, said it was positioned here for a purpose. Above them, floorboards creaked with moving feet. A child's cry, Ethan's, James had learned to tell them apart already, drifted down, followed by soft voices and gentle shushing, the sound of healing, of care, of community in action. They climbed back to the main floor, where Mrs. Henderson was teaching two younger volunteers how to properly warm milk to body temperature. The kitchen windows, cleaned by someone's industrious hands, reflected lamplight like beacons in the darkness. "Temperature's down another 1/4 degree," Doc Matthews reported as they passed the bedroom, both of them. "It's not victory yet, but—" The old doctor's eyes crinkled with cautious hope. Sarah looked up from the rocking chair, her face showing, the first hints of color returning. "Thank you," she whispered, "not to any one person, but to all of them. I never thought—" "Now none of that," Ellen interrupted gently, adjusting a cold compress on Emma's forehead. "Save your strength. These little ones are going to need their mama strong when they're feeling better. When, not if." The word choice wasn't lost on James. He watched Ellen's sure hands, Mrs. Henderson's gentle touch with the milk bottle, the pastor's quiet prayers, the judge's determined ice runs. Each person moving in their own rhythm, but somehow in perfect harmony with the others. The rocking chair kept its steady pace, a metronome marking time through the longest night. James found himself matching his breathing to its rhythm, remembering how Martha used to rock there by lamplight. She'd always said the chair had magic in its wood, the kind of magic that could soothe any trouble, if you just gave it time and faith. Outside, the moon traced its path across the star-strewn sky. Inside, minutes stretched into hours, as the community he'd pushed away for so long worked with quiet determination to save two tiny lives. The house seemed to hold its breath between each temperature reading, each small victory, each setback. Dawn was still hours away, but something was already breaking like morning light across the darkness of 15 years. With each creak of the rocking chair, each whispered prayer, each gentle touch, the walls James had built around his heart crumbled a little more. In their place, something new was being built. Something stronger than one man's grief, more enduring than solitude. Something made of shared purpose and collective hope, of neighbors becoming family and strangers becoming friends. Something that felt, after all these years, like healing. The thermometer slipped from Doc Matthews' hands, shattering against the hardwood floor just as false dawn began to paint the eastern sky. But it wasn't the breaking glass that made everyone in the room freeze. It was the look on the old doctor's face as he stared at the reading he'd just taken from Emma's small form. "Undo 5.2, he announced, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years of medical practice. Her temperature's spiking again, Ethan's holding steady, but Emma—" He trailed off, meeting James's eyes across the room. Sarah half rose from the rocking chair, her face ash-white in the lamplight. "No," she whispered. "Please, no." James moved without conscious thought, crossing to the bed where Emma lay. The baby's breathing had grown labored again, her tiny chest rising and falling in an uneven rhythm. All their progress through the night, the careful measurements of medicine, the constant compresses, the prayers and hopes, seemed to evaporate like morning dew in the Texas sun. "Options," he said, the word coming out like an order. The army medic in him surfaced, pushing aside the tumult of emotions. "Give me options, Doc." Matthews ran a hand through his silver hair. "We've used everything we have. The antibiotics need more time to work, but her fever—" He gestured helplessly at the broken thermometer, its mercury beading like scattered hopes on the floor. Ellen appeared in the doorway, her normally steady hands clutching the doorframe. "The ice is running low. Judge Harrison left for more, but Sterling City's a 2-hour round trip." "She doesn't have 2 hours," James said, his voice flat with certainty. He'd seen that look too many times in field hospitals. The moment when death started gaining ground, when time became the enemy. The room fell silent except for Emma's labored breathing and Sarah's soft prayers. Even Ethan, as if sensing his twin's distress, lay quieter than usual. Outside, the first bird song of morning seemed oddly out of place against the weight of the moment. James closed his eyes, memories washing over him like a flash flood. Another bedside, another night, another impossible choice. Martha's voice, weak but certain. Promise me you won't shut them out, James. Promise me you'll remember what healing really means. He hadn't understood then, had run from the memory of those words for 15 years. But now, his eyes snapped. Open. The spring, he said. What? Doc Matthews looked up sharply. The hidden spring in the north pasture, the one that feeds the creek bed. James was already moving, his voice gaining strength. The water there comes up cold enough to numb your hands, even in summer. Ellen's eyes widened with understanding, like a natural ice bath. Exactly. James turned to Sarah. It's a risk. The shock of the cold. Do it, Sarah interrupted, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. Save my baby. The next moments moved with military precision. James stripped off his shirt, knowing he'd need to get into the spring himself to control Emma's immersion. Ellen and Mrs. Henderson gathered fresh blankets. The pastor ran to saddle Thunder. The spring was too far to carry a sick infant, and the ranch's dirt roads were too rough for cars in the dark. I'm coming too, Doc Matthews announced, already packing his medical bag. We'll need to monitor her closely. James lifted Emma carefully from the bed, her small body burning against his chest. Sarah kissed her daughter's forehead, then stepped back, one hand reaching out to touch Ethan, as if to anchor herself through her son. Mrs. Henderson knows what to do for Ethan, Ellen assured her. You just keep that rocking chair moving. These little ones can feel their mama's strength. The sky was just beginning to show the first threads of real dawn, as James mounted Thunder, Emma secured against him in a sling Ellen had fashioned. Doc Matthews climbed onto the judge's horse, borrowed from the barn. James, Sarah called as they turned to leave. He looked back, seeing in her face the same desperate hope he'd carried on another dawn, 15 years ago. Bring her back to me. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture that carried more meaning than words could hold. Then he nudged Thunder forward, feeling Emma's fever burn against his chest as they rode into the growing light. Behind them, the broken thermometer lay forgotten on the floor, its scattered mercury catching the first rays of sun like tiny stars fallen to earth. The dog-eared medical manual lay open on a flat rock beside the spring, its pages ruffling in the pre-dawn breeze. James had pulled it from his saddlebag by instinct, though he'd memorized its relevant passages years ago during countless nights in Korean field hospitals. The section on treating extreme fevers was worn thin from repeated reading, its margins filled with notes in his precise handwriting. Thunder and the judge's horse grazed nearby as James waded into the spring, holding Emma close to his chest. The water was cold enough to steal his breath, fed by underground streams that never saw sunlight. Doc Matthews knelt at the spring's edge, medical bag open, watching the baby's responses with unwavering attention. Slow and steady, the older doctor reminded him, though James's hands were already moving with practiced care. Let her body adjust gradually. James nodded, his mind flashing back to another time, another place. Like the boys at Chosin Reservoir, he said quietly. Remember how we'd have to warm them up slow, or their hearts would stop? Matthews looked up sharply. You were at Chosin? MASH Unit 8063. James kept his eyes on Emma as he lowered her a fraction more into the spring. Worst winter of my life. Learned more about saving lives in those 3 months than in all my medical training. Combined. The doctor's eyes widened with sudden recognition. Dear Lord, you're that Thornfield, the one they called the miracle medic? Emma stirred in James's arms, letting out a small whimper. He adjusted his hold, remembering other bodies, other lives balanced on the edge between now and never. That was a long time ago, Doc. Another life. They said you could save anybody, that you never lost a patient once they made it to your tent. Matthews pulled out his stethoscope, checking Emma's heart rate. There were stories about you all. Over Korea. Stories don't mean much when you can't save the one person that matters most. James's voice was as cold as the spring water. "Couldn't save Martha, could I? All that training, all those miracles, and I couldn't do a damn thing but watch her slip away." Emma's small hand brushed against his chest, pulling him back to the present. He forced himself to focus, to feel the gradual change in her body. Temperature, to watch for the signs he'd learned through years of practice and intuition. "Heart rate's stabilizing," Matthews reported, professional tone masking his lingering surprise. "Temperature's starting to respond. Whatever else you might think, James, you haven't lost your touch." The sky had begun to lighten, painting the spring surface with pearl and rose. James remembered the first time he'd found this place, just after buying the ranch. Martha had loved it, called it their own private miracle in the desert. "Nature's medicine," she'd said, laughing as she splashed in the cold water. "Tell me about the manual," Matthews said quietly, nodding toward the book. "I've never seen those margin notes before." James shifted Emma slightly, keeping her head well above water. "Started in Korea. Every case, every treatment, every lesson. Learned. I wrote it all down. Added more during my residency after the war. Martha used to tease me about it, said I was writing a book inside a book. And you kept it all these years. Never know when you might need to remember something." James felt Emma's fever beginning to break, her breathing becoming more regular, like treating extreme fever in infants. Page 147. "In absence of modern facilities, gradual cooling through natural means can be effective if carefully monitored." Matthews checked Emma's temperature again. 103.8. 103.5. "It's working, James. Whatever else you've been carrying all these years, you've still got the gift." The gift. James had heard that word so many times in Korea, in medical school. In the early days of his practice, the ability to feel what a patient needed, to know exactly how far to push and when to hold back. He'd thought that gift had died with Martha, buried under 15 years of guilt and isolation. But here, in the growing light of dawn, with the babies, life literally in his hands, James felt something long dormant stirring back to life. The instincts were still there, the knowledge, the purpose. Emma's eyes fluttered open, clearer than they'd been all night. She looked up at him with Martha's. Same shade of blue, the color of summer skies and new beginnings. "Well, little lady," he whispered, his voice rough with emotions he'd forgotten how to name. "Looks like we both had some healing to do." The old coffee pot bubbled cheerfully on the stove as the first true light of day crept through James's kitchen. Windows. Ellen Miller had kept it going through the night, a constant presence marking the hours of their vigil. Now it served as a beacon guiding them home, its rich aroma carrying across the yard as James and Doc Matthews rode in with Emma. The sound of hoofbeats brought the household alive. Sarah appeared on the porch, Ethan cradled in one arm, her free, hand shading her eyes against the rising sun. Behind her, Mrs. Henderson and Pastor Roberts emerged from the house, their faces eager for news. "The fever's broken," Doc Matthews called out, his voice carrying the weight of medical certainty. "She's going to make it." Sarah's knees buckled. The pastor caught her elbow, steadying her as James dismounted, still holding Emma close. The baby slept peacefully now, her breathing easy and regular, her skin cool to the touch. The desperate ride to the spring, the tense minutes of controlled immersion, it had all paid off. Ellen appeared with fresh blankets, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Coffee's hot," she said, her practical tone belying the emotion in her face. "And the judge just got back with more ice, though it looks like we won't be needing it quite. So urgently now." They moved inside as a group, the morning sun painting long shadows across the ranch house floor. The coffee pot steamed on the stove like a sentinel that had kept watch through the darkness, promising warmth and revival to weary bodies and worried hearts. "Let's get her settled," Doc Matthews directed, leading the way to the bedroom. "She'll need to be monitored closely for the next few hours, but the worst is behind us." Sarah laid Ethan down beside his sister, and for the first time since their arrival, both twins slept peacefully side by side. Their small faces, so pinched with fever before, had softened in healing slumber. James watched as Sarah touched each tiny forehead, feeling the normal warmth there instead of the burning heat that had threatened their lives. "I don't know how to thank you," she began, looking up at James with eyes that held the same shade of dawn breaking outside. "All of you. When I started walking yesterday morning, I never imagined—" "Here now," Ellen interrupted gently, pressing a cup of coffee into Sarah's hands. "Drink this first. Thanks can wait until we've all had a proper rest." The coffee pot had been Martha's pride, a heavy copper piece she'd brought from her family home. James hadn't used it since her passing, preferring the simple tin pot that served his solitary needs. But Ellen had found it in the back of a cupboard, somehow knowing its significance without being told. The rich aroma filled the room, mingling with the first rays of sunlight streaming through windows that someone had cleaned during the night. The glass panes caught the light, throwing rainbow patterns across the worn floorboards, nature's own celebration of life continuing, of healing beginning. "They'll both need antibiotics for a while longer," Doc Matthews said, making notes in his medical journal. "And careful monitoring, but children are resilient, given proper care and support." He glanced meaningfully around the room at the gathered community. "They'll have it," Mrs. Henderson stated firmly. "We've already worked out a schedule for the next 2 weeks. Sarah and the twins will stay here until they're strong enough to travel." James looked up sharply at this announcement, but found he had no desire to protest. The thought of his house returning to its former silence suddenly seemed unbearable. Instead, he found himself nodding, remembering Martha's words about the ranch being positioned for a purpose. The coffee pot bubbled again, drawing his attention back to the present. Ellen was pouring cups for everyone, the simple act of sharing warm drink transforming his kitchen into something it hadn't been in 15 years, a gathering place, a healing space, a home. "To new beginnings," Pastor Robert said quietly, raising his cup. The others followed suit, even Sarah managing to lift hers with trembling hands. Through the window, they could see thunder and the judge's horse grazing peacefully in the morning light. The ranch was waking up to a new day, but more than that, it was waking up to a new purpose. The coffee pot's steady presence on the stove seemed to announce that this was not a temporary change. This was a restoration, a return to what the ranch had always been meant to be. James sipped his coffee, letting its familiar warmth fill him. The bitterness he'd carried for so long was being replaced by something else, something that tasted more like hope. Mrs. Henderson's fresh milk pail caught the late afternoon sun as she carried it up the path to the ranch house, its contents swaying with each careful step. The twins had been taking more milk each day, their appetites growing stronger as their health improved. She'd begun timing the evening milking to deliver it still warm, knowing how precious every drop of nourishment was to their recovery. Inside, the ranch house had transformed over the past 3 days. Curtains that had been shut for 15 years now danced in the breeze through open windows. The living room had become a makeshift nursery during the day, with the twins laying on a pallet while Sarah rested in Martha's old rocking chair. The kitchen hummed with activity as volunteers came and went, bringing food and supplies, sharing news and hope in equal measure. "Look who's awake and hungry," Ellen called from the nursery corner as Mrs. Henderson entered with the milk. Emma and Ethan both turned their heads at the sound of her voice, their eyes tracking movement with newfound clarity. Their fevers had stayed down, and each day brought small but significant improvements. "Strong little ones, aren't they?" Mrs. Henderson smiled, transferring the milk to the bottles Ellen had ready. "Just like their mama." Sarah looked up from her mending. Someone had brought her sewing to keep her hands busy during the long hours of recovery. "They get their strength from all of you," she said softly. "I never knew there could be so much kindness in the world." James stood in the doorway watching the scene with a mixture of emotions he was still learning to name. The house, no longer, felt like a museum to his grief, preserved in unchanging sorrow. Life had crept back in through the cracks, like desert flowers after rain. "Mail's here," he announced, holding up a stack of envelopes. Word spread. Letters from folks all over the county offering what they can. Ellen took the letters, sorting them with practiced efficiency. The Anderson family can send more medicine from their store in Sterling City. The Wilsons have extra blankets. And look, the Ladies' Auxiliary in Copper Creek is organizing a supply drive. People remember, Mrs. Henderson said, testing the milk's temperature on her wrist. They remember how this ranch used to be in Martha's day, a place of healing. James felt the familiar tightness in his chest at Martha's name, but it was different now, less like a wound and more like a healing scar. He watched as Mrs. Henderson showed Sarah how to properly warm the bottles, the same way she'd once taught a young Martha years ago. The twins accepted their evening milk eagerly, their small hands reaching up to touch the bottles. Sarah hummed, softly as she fed them, an old lullaby that seemed to fill the room with peace. Even Doc, the German shepherd, had taken to lying protectively near the pallet, his tail thumping gently whenever the babies made their happy feeding sounds. "They're gaining weight," Doc Matthews noted from his chair by the window, where he'd been updating his medical journal. "And their color's better. The antibiotics are doing their job, but I'd say the love and care are doing just as much healing." The evening light slanted through the windows, turning the milk in its pail to liquid gold. Outside, more horses and cars were arriving, the evening shift of volunteers coming to take their turn, the pastor's wife bringing a fresh casserole, the judge returning from another supply run to Sterling City. "You know," Ellen said thoughtfully, "we could set up a proper clinic here. The back room's big enough. Save folks the long drive to Sterling City for basic care." James looked at her sharply, but found himself considering the idea. The ranch was well positioned, centrally located among the scattered farms and homesteads, and he had the training, the knowledge that had lain dormant for so long. "Martha always said this place had a purpose," he said slowly. "Something about being positioned just right, where people needed it most." The milk pail caught another ray of setting sun, sending a warm glow across the room. In its light, James could almost see the future taking shape, not a return to what was, but a step forward into something new. Something that honored Martha's memory, not through isolation, but through service. The twins finished their bottles, settling into contented sleep. Sarah tucked them in, her movements sure and steady now, so different from the desperate mother who had collapsed at his gate. Around them, the community continued its gentle work of restoration, of the twins, of the ranch, of James himself. Like the fresh milk bringing strength back to tiny bodies, hope was flowing again through the veins of this place, turning what had been a fortress of solitude into a beacon of healing. The old well bucket swung from James's hand as he and the judge made their way to the spring that had saved Emma's life. 5 days had passed since that desperate pre-dawn ride, and the twins were growing stronger by the hour. But James couldn't shake the thought that had been forming in his mind since that morning, about water, healing, and purpose. "You're telling me this spring's been here all along?" Judge Harrison asked, leaning on his cane as they followed the creek bed. "Right here on your property." "Martha found it first," James replied, ducking under a low-hanging mesquite branch. "Called it her secret garden. I hadn't been back here since—" He let the words trail off, but the judge nodded in understanding. The morning sun filtered through the trees, painting dappled patterns on the ground. Ahead, they could hear the soft music of running water, an almost miraculous sound in drought-stricken Texas. The spring emerged from a natural rock formation, its clear water pooling briefly before continuing downstream. James knelt beside the pool, dipping the well bucket into its depths. "Watch this," he said, pulling it up and offering it to the judge. "Taste it." The older man took a careful sip, then his eyes widened. "Sweet," he said in surprise, "and cold. As December. This isn't just any spring water." "No, it's not." James took out the papers he'd been studying late into the night. Geological surveys from his ranch's original land deed. "Look here. This formation matches the markers for an artesian aquifer. The water's coming up from deep underground, filtered, through layers of limestone. The judge studied the maps, his judicial mind putting the pieces together. You're thinking this could help with the drought. More than that, James stood, gesturing at the surrounding area. This spring saved Emma's life. Got me thinking about what else it could do. The flow rate's strong enough to support irrigation for at least 4 farms. Maybe more if we engineer it right. The bucket caught a ray of sunlight. Water droplets, sparkling like diamonds as they fell back into the pool. The judge ran his hand over his chin, considering. Would take some doing. Pipes, pumps, agreements between landowners, community effort, James nodded, like what we did for the twins. They stood in companionable silence, listening to the spring's gentle song. A pair of doves called from nearby trees, and somewhere, downstream, a fox slipped through the brush. Even the air felt different here, cooler, alive with possibility. You know what this means, don't you? The judge said finally. Once word gets out about this water source, people will come, James finished. Like they used to in Martha's day. Maybe that's not such a bad thing anymore. He picked up the bucket again, remembering how it had felt to hold Emma in that spring, feeling her fever break in the healing waters, the same waters that could now help heal the parched land around them. We'll need to test it properly, the judge was saying, already planning. Get the county extension agent out here, draw up water rights agreements, but James, he placed a gnarled hand on the younger man's shoulder. This could change everything for Promise. They made their way back toward the ranch house, the bucket now full of spring water for testing. As they crested the small rise, they could see the house below, its windows open to the morning breeze. Sarah sat on the porch with the twins, reading them a story from one of Martha's old books that Ellen had found in the attic. Doc Matthews' truck was pulling up the drive, and Mrs. Henderson's daughter was arriving with fresh bread and milk. The scene struck James with unexpected force, not as an invasion of his solitude, but as a fulfillment of something long promised. He remembered Martha's words about the ranch being positioned for a purpose. She'd seen it all along. The healing waters, the central location, the potential for something larger than one man's grief. You're smiling? The judge observed, his own weathered face creasing with understanding. First time I've seen that in 15 years. James touched the bucket's worn handle, feeling the smooth spots where countless hands had gripped it over generations. Martha always said everything happens in its own time, he said quietly. Guess the time for hiding away is past. The springs. Water caught the sunlight, transforming the simple well bucket into a vessel of promise, not just for 2 tiny lives, but for an entire community dying of thirst. The foundation stone sat on James's kitchen table, its rough-hewn surface catching the afternoon light. Mason Thompson had quarried it himself from the same limestone formation that filtered the spring's healing waters. Carved into its face were the words Thornfield Medical Station, Esther 1962, the date marking both the year of James's return from Korea and the year he'd first bought the ranch with Martha. Around the table, the core planning committee had gathered, Doc Matthews with his medical records, Ellen with her practical lists, the judge with his legal papers, and Pastor Roberts with his community contacts. Sarah sat in Martha's rocking chair nearby, the twins sleeping peacefully in a makeshift bassinet beside her. The county board approved the initial water rights agreements this morning, Judge Harrison announced, spreading documents across the table. They're calling it the Promise Valley Water Project. Once the engineering survey's complete, we can start laying pipe. Ellen added another item to her growing list. The ladies' auxiliary has already raised enough for the first phase of clinic supplies. And Doc Matthews, didn't you say some of your colleagues in Sterling City offered to help staff it? The old doctor nodded, touching the foundation stone. Reverently, 2 young doctors looking to set up rural practices. They're excited about the idea of a satellite clinic, said it's exactly what the region needs. James studied the stone, remembering the day he'd first dreamed of building a clinic. Here. Martha had encouraged it, but after losing her, he'd locked that dream away along with everything else. Now it was emerging again, transformed by time and circumstance into something larger than his original vision. the spring water tests came. "Back," Pastor Roberts added, pulling out a report. "Pure as anything you'd find in a mountain stream. The limestone filtration makes it naturally mineral-rich. No wonder it helped with the twins' recovery." Sarah touched the bassinet gently as Emma stirred and settled. "It's amazing to think their fever led to all this. That something so frightening could turn into such a blessing for everyone." "Martha used to say that's how grace works," James said quietly. "Shows up in desperate moments, then spreads out like ripples in a pond." Ellen reached over and squeezed his hand, a gesture that would have sent him retreating to his solitude just weeks ago. Now he accepted it, understanding it as part of the healing that had begun the moment Sarah collapsed at his gate. "We'll need to consider access roads," the judge continued. "All business. The clinic and the water project will bring more traffic than these old ranch paths can handle. And housing for the medical staff," Ellen added. "The east pasture would be perfect for a small residential area. Good drainage, nice views." James found himself nodding. The east pasture had been Martha's favorite spot for wildflower gathering. She'd always said it was too pretty for grazing cattle. "What about the name?" Pastor Roberts asked, gesturing to the foundation stone. "Thornfield Medical Station seems a bit formal for our community." "Martha's Haven," Sarah suggested softly. All eyes turned to her. If that would be all right, Mr. Thornfield, since she's the one who first saw what this place could be." James felt something shift in his chest, like a locked door finally, swinging free. "Martha's Haven," he repeated, tasting the words. "For the whole project, the clinic and the water distribution both." Doc Matthews pulled out his pen, making a note in his ever-present medical journal. "Martha's Haven Health and Water Project has a nice ring to it." The foundation stone seemed to glow warmer in the afternoon light. Outside, they could hear the sounds of work already beginning. Volunteers clearing the east pasture, surveyors marking the waterline routes, carpenters measuring for clinic renovations. The community had seized onto hope with both hands, transforming it from dream to reality with remarkable speed. "We'll need a proper dedication ceremony," Ellen said, practical as always. "Something to mark the official beginning." "This is the official beginning," James said, surprising them all. "Right here with this foundation stone and these plans. Everything else is just details." Sarah stood carefully, lifting Ethan as he began to fuss. "Would you like to hold him, Mr. Thornfield? He seems to settle better with you these days." James accepted the baby, marveling as always at how such a small life could carry such weight of meaning. Ethan gazed up at him with trust born of days, of care, his tiny hand wrapping around one weathered finger. The foundation stone waited on the table, ready to take its place in the new clinic's walls. But the true foundation, James realized, had already been laid, in desperate prayers over fever-stricken twins, in a community's determination to help, in the discovery of healing waters, and in the gradual opening of a heart long closed too. Hope! The new shawl lay draped across Sarah's bed, its soft wool catching the morning light that streamed through freshly washed windows. The women of promise had worked on it together, each taking a turn at the knitting while sitting watch over the twins. Within its warm folds, they'd woven their hopes for the young family's future. Mrs. Henderson's sturdy border speaking of protection, Ellen's intricate center pattern promising prosperity, and countless other stitches carrying prayers and well-wishes from the community. "It's time for their checkup," Doc Matthews announced, entering the bedroom with his medical bag. 2 weeks had passed since the desperate night at the spring, and the twins had flourished under the constant care of what Sarah now thought of as her extended family. Emma and Ethan lay on the bed, kicking their feet at a mobile someone had fashioned from bright scraps of fabric. Their cheeks were rosy with health, their eyes bright and curious. Doc Matthews checked them over with professional thoroughness, though his face already wore the smile of a man confirming what he knew to be true. "Strong as Texas Longhorns," he declared, putting away his stethoscope. "I'd say they're ready to face the world." Sarah touched the shawl, her fingers tracing the patterns of kindness woven into every stitch. "I never thought," she began, then had to stop and collect herself. "When I started walking that day, I was so sure I was going to lose them. Instead, you found something bigger than any of us imagined," Ellen said from the doorway. She carried a basket of fresh clothes, laundered and folded with grandmother's precision. "You found a whole community waiting to be born again." Through the window, they could hear the sounds of construction from the east pasture. The clinic's framework was already rising, its outline clean against the morning sky. Trucks moved back and forth along the newly graded road, carrying supplies for both the medical center and the water project. "The judge says your house will be ready by next week," Ellen continued, setting down the basket. "Just a stone's throw from the clinic, close enough for James to keep an eye on things, he says." Sarah smiled, remembering James's gruff offer of the housing lot. He tried to make it sound purely practical. Having a mother with twins nearby would help convince other families the clinic was child-friendly. But she'd seen the way he watched the babies, how his face softened when they gripped his fingers, or fell asleep in his arms. "Speaking of James," Doc Matthews said, packing up his bag, "he asked me to remind you about the paperwork for your new position." The nurse's certificate lay on the bedside table, its edges still crisp. Sarah had earned it before marriage, before the drought had pushed her husband east in search of work. Now it represented a future she hadn't dared. Imagine 2 weeks ago, a job at Martha's Haven, a home for her children, a community that had embraced them all. "Hard to believe how much has changed," she said, lifting Emma as the baby began to fuss. 2 weeks ago we were strangers. Now you're family," Ellen finished firmly. "That's what promise does. When we remember who we are, we take care of our own." Outside, a meadowlark's song carried across the morning air. Sarah wrapped the new shawl around her shoulders, its weight settling like a blessing. So different from the torn one she'd worn on her desperate journey, yet carrying echoes of the same maternal protection, multiplied now by the love of an entire community. Emma quieted against her shoulder while Ethan watched the mobile dance. In the breeze, they were too young to remember the fever that had nearly taken them, too innocent to understand how their lives had transformed not just their mother's fate, but the future of an entire valley. Someday Sarah would tell them the story of a desperate walk, a healing spring, and a community that found its heart again. "Time for their morning walk," Ellen announced. "The garden club's finished planting Martha's flowers around the clinic. Foundation, you should see how they've bloomed." Sarah gathered her children, wrapping them warmly despite the mild day. The new shawl covered them all, its soft wool smelling of lavender and promise. As they stepped onto the porch, she saw James by the clinic site, discussing plans with the construction foreman. He touched his hat when he saw them, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. The morning sun painted everything in shades of hope, the rising clinic walls, the surveyor's stakes marking water lines, the fresh-turned earth of healing gardens. Sarah held her twins close, feeling their strong heartbeats against her chest. They had come so far from that desperate day, carried by the strength of a community that had remembered its own heart in the process of healing theirs. The family photograph sat in a silver frame on the clinic's reception desk, taken 6 months to the day since Sarah had collapsed at James's gate. In it, the twins beamed from their perch on either side of the foundation stone, their healthy faces a testament to the miracle that had started it all. Sarah stood behind them, wearing the community-made shawl despite the warm day. James stood to one side, his usual stoic expression softened by something that might have been contentment. Around them gathered the faces of promise. Doc Matthews, Ellen, Mrs. Henderson, the judge, Pastor Roberts, and dozens more who had become family in all but name. The late afternoon sun slanted through the clinic's windows, painting patterns across the worn boards of what had once been James's living room. The space had been transformed, yet somehow retained the warmth of a home. Martha's old rocking chair, still held its place of honor in the corner, now serving as a comfort to worried mothers and tired seniors alike. Last patient of the day, Ellen announced from her desk, where she'd taken on the role of clinic administrator with characteristic efficiency. Unless we get any emergencies. James looked up from reviewing patient charts, his reading glasses, a recent concession to time, perched on his nose. Mrs. Turner's arthritis check? No, actually, someone new. Just moved to the valley, drawn by word of the water project. Ellen's eyes twinkled. Says she's heard good things about the doctor who runs it. The water project had succeeded beyond their wildest hopes. The spring's careful distribution had brought life back to 4 neighboring farms already, with more connections planned. The past month had seen the first green shoots in fields that had been brown for years, and the promise of a real harvest had drawn new families to the area. The waiting room door opened, admitting a young couple with a toddler. The woman was visibly pregnant, worry lines creasing her forehead. "We heard," she began hesitantly, "we heard this was a place that helped people, that understood about babies and hard times." James felt something shift in his chest, a familiar warmth that no longer surprised him. He stood, gesturing to Martha's rocking chair. "Why don't you settle yourself there, Mrs. Carson?" she supplied, easing into the chair. "Amy Carson, we've been trying to make it on our own, but with the baby coming." "Nobody makes it entirely on their own here," Ellen interrupted gently, already pulling out new patient forms. "That's not how promise works anymore." Through the window, they could hear children's laughter from the clinic's garden, where Sarah was teaching a group of local kids about medicinal herbs. The twins, now sturdy toddlers, played nearby under Mrs. Henderson's watchful eye. Their voices carried clearly, Emma's infectious giggle and Ethan's more serious tones, both of them growing strong in the valley's healing air. The photograph caught the last sunlight, drawing James's eye again. It had been taken at the official dedication of Martha's Haven, though the place had been serving the community long before the ceremony. He remembered standing before the gathered crowd that day, finding words he hadn't known he possessed. "Martha always said this land had a purpose," he'd told them. "Took me 15 years and 2 sick babies to understand what she meant. This place, it's not just about medical care or water rights. It's about remembering who we are when times get hard. About how healing works best when it flows through an entire community." Now, watching Amy Carson settle into Martha's rocking chair, James saw another circle preparing to complete itself. The young woman's worried face echoed Sarah's desperate expression from that fateful morning. But this time, help wouldn't come at the last possible moment. This time, an entire community stood ready to support a family in need. "Tell me about your concerns," he said, pulling up a chair. His voice carried the warmth of experience now, tempered by months of renewed purpose. "And then we'll talk about how we can help." As he listened to the Carson story, James was aware of the bustling life around him. Ellen efficiently organizing. Records. Sarah's voice drifting in from the garden, the twins' laughter mingling with the sound of construction from the new residential area. The busy, healing sounds of a community that had remembered its heart. The family photograph stood witness to it all, its silver frame reflecting the day's last light. In it, they were all captured in a moment of triumph, the dedication of Martha's Haven. But the true miracle James had come to understand wasn't in any one moment. It was in the daily acts of caring, the constant flow of help and hope, like the spring's waters bringing life back to the valley. Later, after the Carsons had left with renewed hope and a treatment plan, James stood in the clinic doorway watching. The sun set. Sarah approached with the twins, their small hands clasped in hers, their faces glowing with health and happiness. "Ready to head home?" she asked. Ellen said she'll lock up. Home. The word had come to mean so much more than just a place. It now encompassed all of promise. The clinic, the healing spring, the growing community, and most of all, the people who had taught him how to live again. "Yes," he said, touching the brim of his hat out of habit. "Let's go home." Behind him, the family photograph caught the day's last light, blessing them all with a warm golden glow, a final gift from a sun setting on one chapter and rising on another in an endless cycle of healing and hope.